In an upscale restaurant in Lagos State, a group of young ladies were having a fun time at a birthday party when one of their phones rang. Blessing picked up her phone. It was her husband. Her friend's attention turned to her as they could hear her husband shouting down the line. "Where are you? It's almost 7 p.m., Cosmas bellowed. Blessing grimaced. "I told you it's Ngozi's birthday today. We are at the restaurant. I will be home shortly." Ngozi and the other party-goers could not help but listen in on the conversation. Unfortunately, this was behavior typical of Blessing's husband. "Are you sure there are no men there? Switch to video call and let me see for myself." Blessing's face fell. She felt embarrassed, but she knew her husband. If she didn't do as she was told, he would become difficult. She put the call on video, and Cosmas, frowning face, came into full view. She filmed herself making sure she got all her friends in the restaurant. There was an awkward silence as Cosmas peered at them all. "My goodness, Blessing, look at what you are wearing. This is what a night walker would wear, and not a respectable married woman." The women gasped. Blessing was always dressed in a long flowing gown that covered most of her body. Blessing looked around at her friends apologetically. She hurried out of the restaurant and wasn't seen for a few minutes. When she came back, she apologized to the others and excused herself. Her husband wanted her back home immediately. The party for her was over. When she got home, she got a tongue lashing from her husband. He was annoyed that she had stayed out that late on a school night. He was upset that she wore something, which, in his own opinion, was revealing. And finally, hadn't he warned her? She wasn't allowed to hang out with single women. He had seen Onome and Yetunde at the party, and they were unmarried, and therefore a bad example for her. Blessing listened to his tirade sadly. Her husband's jealousy was getting worse, and it seemed no amount of reassurance was enough for him. The next day, Cosmas was still complaining to his best friend, Steve. Steve listened to Cosmas for what seemed an eternity. It was always the same. Cosmas believed that his wife was having an affair, but he had never been able to offer any proof. "I have known Blessing for over 10 years. Your wife is the most virtuous person I know," Steve said. Cosmas frowned. "Trust you to always take her side. You have done this right from our university days." Steve rolled his eyes. They had all met in the University of Lagos. Steve and Cosmas were in the same room and had become best friends. Steve was a medical student, while Cosmas was studying business admin. Steve was also friends with Blessing, who was easily the most beautiful girl on campus. One day, Cosmas had seen Steve walking with Blessing, and in the evening, he had excitedly confronted him. "Who is that angel I saw you with?" he asked. "You mean Blessing. I met her in the cafeteria. She is a babe. I have been chatting to her for a few weeks, but she doesn't seem interested. I am in the friend zone." Cosman's face fell. Steve was tall and handsome, and a ladies' man. If Blessing wasn't interested in him, then what chance did he have? "Would you like me to introduce you guys?" "If she doesn't like you, then she will not like me," Cosmas said, laughing. "Rubbish. She says I look like a ladies' man and not to be trusted. You might be what she wants." Later that week, Steve introduced Blessing to Cosmas, and it was instant chemistry. Although Cosmas was not the tall, dark, and handsome type, he was funny and intelligent, and that was exactly what Blessing desired in a man. Soon they were dating, and not long after Blessing graduated, Cosmas proposed, and they were married. Not long after their wedding, Blessing discovered a dark side of Cosmas's character. He was an incredibly jealous and possessive man. He had always thought she was out of his league, and this ate him up and made him madly jealous of other men in her life. Everywhere they went, people would say things like, "Wow, how did you catch her? What charms did you use on this angel? You did well, Cosmas." The truth is that Blessing was incredibly elegant and beautiful, complimented on her appearance wherever they went, and Cosmas grew to hate it, especially when the compliments came from men. Cosmas suffered from a severe inferiority complex and allowed intrusive thoughts to silently creep into his mind until it reached a point he convinced himself that Blessing was having affairs with every tall, handsome man in Lagos. Their first few years of marriage was a financial struggle for Cosmas. His business was not doing well. Blessing, on the other hand, had gotten a job as a HR assistant in a prestigious bank and was on a good salary. One day, Cosmas went to pick her up from work and met her boss for the first time. His heart ran cold as he surveyed him. "Meet my husband. Cosmas, this is my boss, Mr. Okon." Mr. Okon smiled and extended a hand. "Nice to meet you." The smile on Okon's face dimmed as he was left hanging by Cosmas. Mr. Okon was tall, well-built, smooth dark-skinned, and had the facial features of a Nollywood actor. Cosmas' mind went into overdrive, and all sorts of scenarios popped up in his head. Cosmas sulked over the next few weeks. He had heard scandalous stories of what was happening in the banking sector. In his fevered imagination, they were all sleeping with themselves and there was no respect for married women. He managed to convince himself that Blessing was having a full-blown affair with Mr. Okon. One night, he woke her up. "I am not comfortable with you working long hours with Mr. Okon." Blessing rubbed her sleepy eyes. "I don't understand." Cosmas rose from bed and regarded her wife. "Over the past few weeks, you have been coming home at 7 p.m. I am not comfortable with that. I want you to quit your job. I can provide for us. My business is doing better." Blessing was horrified. She enjoyed her work and she earned a lot more than her husband. It made no sense for her to quit, especially as Mr. Okon was a happily married man who had never acted inappropriately towards her. "Mr. Okon is married with 2 kids. He is also a pastor in his church. You have nothing to worry about. He has never hit on me or anyone for that matter." Cosmas scoffed. "Pastor, my foot. They are just as randy as other men. I am not comfortable with you spending long hours with him, period." The argument lingered long into the night, and finally, they had to call Cosmas's uncle to mediate. Uncle Stanley, a wise elder, listened to both sides intently. He sighed as he didn't think his nephew Cosmas had much of a point. He knew Blessing loved him and had never given him any reason to doubt her fidelity. They were also expecting twins, and Blessing was the primary breadwinner, as her salary was much more than what Cosmas earned. He tried to talk sense to him, but he would not budge. "You don't know how these Lagos men are, Uncle Stanley. I do not want her working at all. I want her to be a housewife. We can manage my earnings. My business is picking up." Blessing was horrified. She was a well-educated, intelligent woman, and the thought of being a stay-at-home mother filled her with dread. Uncle Stanley and Cosmas had a long chat, and Cosmas eventually compromised. She could go on working as long as it was with a female boss and all her salary came to him. "If she can get a job with a female boss, then I am willing to allow her to work. I also want her salary to come into my account. I am a better financial manager than she is, and that's how my parents managed their money." In Cosmas' twisted mind, the less money Blessing had, the less likely she would have the means to cheat. Blessing reluctantly agreed to quit her job at the bank. Fortunately for her, she soon found a job at a big multinational company, and her department was headed by a woman. Her salary was also better, and every month she would transfer it to her husband's account, as agreed. "Is that wise?" Ngozi, her best friend, asked. She was worried about Blessing. She seemed not to have a say in her marriage. Blessing smiled, but it didn't reach her face. She felt humiliated, but she was never going to admit it to Ngozi. They were having lunch at an high-end restaurant, and Ngozi was appalled that she had to call her husband to ask for money to pay her share of the bill. "It's your money. You should not be giving it to him," Ngozi said. "We look at it as a joint account," she said, forcing lightness into her voice. "He gives me part of my salary as housekeeping, and I have access to the rest whenever I need it." Ngozi was raging inside. They were supposed to have a girls' outing with Yetunde and Onome, but Blessing had said her husband did not want her mingling with single women. Isn't his best friend, Steve, single as well? That's double standards, Ngozi said. He is, but he says it's different. Look, Ngozi, I just want peace in my marriage. I hope that one day he realizes that I would never cheat on him. Ngozi sighed. Blessing was such a sweetheart. She didn't deserve what Cosmas was putting her through. They were blessed with twin boys in the 3rd year of marriage. Blessing's star was on the rise at work. She was a smart and hard worker and rose quickly through the ranks. Cosmas' business was also doing well, and all seemed well for a while, until Mrs. Martin's, Blessing's boss's marriage, fell apart. When Cosmas heard, he frowned. I am not so sure I am comfortable with you working with a single woman, he said. Blessing could not believe her ears. What do you mean? Single women are a bad influence. They always have randy men flocking around them. I am not comfortable with it. And so was the start of another contentious issue. Cosmas sulked and moaned and was a general pain over the next few weeks. He wanted Blessing to find new employment, and Blessing, this time, stood her ground. Finally, Uncle Stanley had to wade in again. He was eventually able to convince Cosmas to let Blessing continue her work with certain caveats. She would not work later than 5 p.m. She would not attend any after-hours office functions, and he would buy all her work clothes for her to ensure she was decently dressed in the office. Blessing felt degraded, but reluctantly agreed. Don't you think that's a bit draconian? Steve said. Cosmas and Steve were in his office. Steve was a successful doctor with his own practice in a wealthy area of town. Cosmas frowned. You have to do these things these days. There are too many men that do not respect the sanctity of marriage. Don't you think you are being a hypocrite? After all, you have several girlfriends yourself. Steve retorted. It is different for a man, and you know it. I don't know why you are bringing that up in the first place. I apologize, Dr. Steve said. It's just that I have known Blessing for years, and she would never cheat on you. I am afraid if you continue this, you will drive her away. Plus, you really should practice what you preach and be monogamous yourself. Look, let's change the subject, Cosmas said. I have good news. She is pregnant. We are expecting our 3rd child. One day, Ms. Martins called Blessing into her office. She wore a strange look on her face. I have noticed that you do not attend any of our after-hours workshops, Blessing. Is there a problem? Blessing frowned. She had been dreading this day. Tearfully, she explained everything to Miss Martins. Miss Martins was aghast. She couldn't believe her ears. It all made sense now. The change in dressing from sophisticated to drab. The hurry to leave work at 5 p.m. Her anti-social behavior. What a terrible little man her husband is. Blessing was such a smart and beautiful woman. She deserved better than to be under the thumb of a crude man like Cosmas. You really have to give him your salary every month? Miss Martins asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. Blessing nodded sadly. Miss Martins sighed. You need to talk to him. I can no longer tolerate you not attending workshops. You are a rising star in this company, and I see you going to the very top, but you must participate in all after-work activities. We have a team-building exercise, and we are traveling out of town for the weekend next month. It is vital you are there. Blessing and Cosmas had a terrible argument that night. Cosmas was enraged. We had an agreement. You follow my rules, and I allow you to work. I will not be dictated to in my marriage by a woman who cannot keep a husband. As usual, Uncle Stanley was drafted in to resolve the matter, but this time Cosmas wouldn't budge. His business was thriving, and money was flowing in, and he felt in a better position to put his foot down. There would be no after-work activities, he insisted. He was rich enough to cater for his expanding family, and he wanted Blessing to be a housewife. After a mighty battle, Blessing gave in to her husband's demands. She quit her job. They welcomed a 3rd child. Over time, she resigned herself to her fate and dedicated her full energy into raising her children, and for a while, Cosmas was happy. One day, Cosmas was having a few beers with Dr. Steve and a few other friends. The topic of paternity came up. It is said that 1 in 5 men are not raising their kids in Nigeria, Steve said, laughing. I don't believe you, another friend said. It's quite true, Dr. Steve said. I have a friend that conducts paternity tests, Mr. Davis. He showed me the figures and I was blown away. Lagos in particular is bad. They all laughed except Cosmas. A terrible notion had sparked in his head. What is it, Cosmas? Why are you so quiet? Dr. Steve asked, frowning. Cosmas' heart was hammering in his chest. Ever since his kids were born, he would always hear statements like, "What handsome boys, they must take after their mother," or "Their mother's genes are strong," or "Make sure the next one looks like you." He had never thought anything of it until that moment. Indeed, none of his children favored him. They all looked like their mother. He voiced his concern to Steve. Now you are being ridiculous, Steve said, appalled. Those boys are clearly yours. Unfortunately, once an idea had popped into Cosmas' head, he found it impossible to let it go. The next morning at breakfast, he found himself staring at his sons. The twins looked nothing like him, and the baby was a clone of his mom. No matter how much he tried, he could see none of himself in the babies. That very afternoon, he took the boys to the supermarket. As usual, people were gushing over them. Such beautiful boys, an old woman said. They must look like their mother. It was an innocent enough comment, but it was the last straw for Cosmas. He would have to get them tested. The very next day, he drove to Steve's hospital. I want a paternity test, he said. Those boys are not mine. Steve could not believe his ears. Cosmas, I am afraid you are losing it, and if you continue pushing Blessing like this, she will leave you. Those kids are yours, and you know it. You yourself said that 1 in 5 men are not raising their kids. Look, he showed Steve a picture of Mr. Okon, Blessing's ex-boss. Don't the twins look like him? Steve rolled his eyes. He had never known anybody as jealous and unreasonable as his friend. No, they do not look like this man. They look like their mom. Stop it right now. But Cosmas wouldn't let it go. The next day, a tearful Blessing went to see Steve at his hospital. Can you believe that Cosmas wants a DNA test? He is saying the children are not his. She was crying hysterically. I swear to my God that I have never cheated on him. He is driving me crazy. It's always one thing or the other with him. Let me talk to him, Steve said. No, if that's what he wants, then he can have the paternity test. I have nothing to hide. The boys are his. Steve reluctantly agreed to do the paternity test at his friend's, Dr. Davis' hospital. On the day of the results, he followed them to the center on the insistence of Blessing. So we have the results of the paternity test, Dr. Davis said with a poker face. Cosmas was sweating, while Blessing just looked sad. In the case of the twin boys, Benji and Bobby, the doctor said, Mr. Cosmas, I am sorry. You are not the father. Steve gasped and looked at Blessing, who suddenly looked as if she had seen a ghost. I knew it. My mind told me. Cosmas screamed, getting up. So you brought Okon's children for me to raise, you evil woman. It cannot be true. I have never cheated, Blessing said, her voice shaking. Her world started to spin and she thought she would faint. What about the baby? The last born? Cosmas demanded. In the case of baby Bright, Mr. Cosmas, you are not the father. I am so sorry. There was pandemonium in the office. Blessing screamed, then fainted. Steve immediately rushed to her. Let her die. The witch. You all thought I was mad, but I knew she was cheating all along. The next hour was a blur. Cosmas bolted out of the building, leaving Steve and Blessing. Eventually, Blessing came around and would not stop crying. It has to be a mistake, she said, through tears. I have never cheated. Steve, you have known me half my life. I promise you. Steve and the Dr. Davis looked at themselves sadly. I am sorry, Mrs. Blessing, but there is no mistake. You are welcome to do another test in another clinic. Steve drove an inconsolable Blessing home. When they got to her house, they saw her belongings outside and the kids crying by the doorstep. The nanny was holding the baby. Olga says that we are not allowed inside, the nanny said, looking confused. Steve went indoors and found Cosmas. Let's do another test, he told a fuming Cosmas. You people can do 1 billion tests. Those kids are not mine. I am getting a divorce. I don't ever want to see that woman or her kids again. Steve spent a few minutes trying to talk to Cosmas, but his mind was made up. Reluctantly, he went outside. Where will we go? Blessing said, wailing. I have no money. He hasn't let me work for years. My parents are in Port Harcourt. You can stay with me until you find a place, Steve said sadly. My house is big enough for yourself and the kids. Don't worry. I will organize another test at a separate clinic, and we will clear everything up. Steve organized another test, but the result was the same. Blessing was in a state of shock. Her world was falling apart before her very eyes, and she felt she was in a bad dream. I swear to you, Steve, I have never so much as kissed another man. Maybe there was a mix-up in the hospital. They were at Steve's 3-bed duplex. Blessing, you can confide in me. I won't judge you. Blessing looked at Steve. She had aged in a few weeks. Her eyes were puffy from sleepless nights, and she had lost weight. My God, Steve, don't you believe me? I swear on my children's lives, those boys are Cosmas. Steve brokered a meeting between Cosmas and Blessing. Uncle Stanley and Blessing's parents were also there. It was chaos. Cosmas was still raging and called Blessing all manners of vile names. Blessing and her mother were crying non-stop. Uncle Stanley, Steve and Blessing's father, could do nothing but look on sadly. You never know about people, Uncle Stanley mused. He would never have guessed that a soft-spoken, angelic-looking woman like Blessing could be capable of such demonic actions. If she confesses, perhaps there's a way we can salvage something, Uncle Stanley said. Blessing, my daughter, it is time you came clean, her father said, looking morose. I swear those are his kids, she said tearfully, as God is my witness. Cosmas raged. You see the lying harlot. Science does not lie. Those little devils are not mine. The meeting went on for hours, but nothing could be resolved. Cosmas wanted nothing to do with Blessing and the kids, and no one could convince him otherwise. He produced a file and tossed it at Blessing. Those are divorce papers. Sign them quickly. I want nothing to do with you people any longer. Blessing went back to Steve's place. Her parents were poor, and there was no space in their home for her and the kids. Months went by, and she fell into a... Steve found himself taking care of the kids, paying the school fees for the twins and daycare for the baby. He moved to the ground floor of his duplex, leaving the top floor for Blessing, the nanny, and the kids. Blessing was a shell of herself. She hardly left her room and ate very little. All she did was cry and pray to God for vindication. Indeed, if it wasn't for her children, she would have lost the will to live. Months passed, and slowly she started getting better. Steve was godsend. He took care of them as if they were his family. They did not lack for anything. One day, Blessing said to him, Dear Steve, you have been my rock. I will forever be indebted for what you have done for me. However, I feel it's time for me to find my feet. Steve looked at her, his heart melting. It's no bother. You can stay as long as you want, he said. Blessing looked down, her face sad. I know you think I am an evil woman, but I promise I am innocent. God knows why this is happening, but when I think about it, I wasn't happy with Cosmas. Would you like another test? Blessing shook her head, a wry smile on her face. I have been thinking. I went through hell with Cosmas, and I want nothing to do with him. The boys are his, and I have nothing to prove. I have signed the divorce papers, and there's no going back. Over the coming weeks, Blessing started feeling better. She started eating, going out, and slowly the dark cloud over her lifted. She found herself crying less, and she put everything in God's hands. She begged Steve for a job in his hospital, and he found her employment on the front desk. Blessing was earning a fraction of what she was used to, but she loved the job, and the fact she was busy took her mind off her problems. When Steve's personal assistant left, he suggested she do the job. Blessing became Steve's PA. She was smart, hardworking, and a good team member. Soon she became invaluable to him. One night after work, Steve suggested they have some drinks. They had a bottle of wine in a bar and talked long into the night. It was like the good old days in university. "You know I always liked you," Steve said out of the blue. Blessing blushed as he noticed a look in Steve's eyes. "Stop it, Steve. You are like a big brother to me." Steve stared at her intently. Suddenly, he leaned in and tried to kiss her. Blessing jerked back surprised. "No, Steve, please." "Why not?" Steve said, disappointed. "Is it because of Cosmas?" Blessing nodded. "You are a darling, Steve, but you are like a brother to me. I can't do it. Besides, it's too soon." Steve nodded. He was silent during the drive home. Over the next few weeks, Steve propositioned Blessing several times, and she always rebuffed him. Slowly, Steve's attitude to her changed. He became cold and snapped at her over minor things. Even though they worked together, sometimes he would ignore her altogether. Blessing tried to reason with him, but his attitude only grew worse. Blessing had no choice but to quit her job as his PA. Steve was becoming unbearable. He made no attempt to stop her, which hurt her feelings even more. She moved into a small one-bedroom apartment with her kids and started job hunting. Soon she got a job in a large insurance company. Over the next few years, she worked her way up the ladder and started earning a good salary. She moved to a bigger apartment. Slowly she found that she thought less and less about Cosmas and the nightmare she had gone through. Her boys were thriving, and it was with a shock that she realized she was happier being single than being married to Cosmas. She reveled in her newfound freedom. She wore dresses that she wasn't allowed to wear when she was married and rekindled her friendship with Yetunde and Onome, her single friends. One day, after giving a talk at a conference, someone tapped her on the shoulder. It was Mr. Okon, her old boss. What a pleasant surprise, Blessing. "Wow, Mr. Okon, quite an age. What are you doing here?" "He was there on business," he said. "The bank was looking for a new insurance company for the staff, and he was considering the company Blessing worked for. They talked for a while, catching up on old times and exchanged numbers." Over the following weeks, Blessing and Mr. Okon talked business frequently, and this slowly morphed into more personal conversations. "How's your husband?" he asked one day. Blessing's face fell. She told him they were divorced. "Oh, I am so sorry to hear that. I lost my wife a few years ago," he said. One day Mr. Okon called her. "I would like to see you," he said. "Oh, is it about the new policy?" There was an awkward silence on the line. "No, it's personal. I was hoping we could have a lunch date." Blessing fell silent. She wasn't sure of what to make of it. "I am sorry, but I'm not quite sure I am ready," she finally said. "That's okay. The offer remains anytime you are ready." Their friendship deepened, and they talked constantly on the phone. He was a very witty man and was a good listener, and soon Blessing found herself looking forward to his nightly calls. One night, she said, "Is that offer still open?" Blessing and Okon started dating. They had a lot in common, and their relationship blossomed over the next few months. One day, she got a terrible call from Steve that totally unnerved her. "You ungrateful harlot," he screamed. Blessing was stunned. "I beg your pardon. I hear you are going out with your ex-boss. After all that I did for you, you dump me and immediately move on to the next man." Blessing was lost for words. This was a side of Steve she had never seen. Steve, you know I am grateful to you. Shut up. Maybe Cosmas was right about you after all. You've been sleeping with him all this while. Blessing hung up the phone trembling. She couldn't believe what had just happened. That night, Steve called her 40 times, but she didn't answer. The next morning, as she was going to work, Steve appeared from nowhere as she opened her car door. Blessing, I am so sorry for what I said. I was drunk. Blessing stared at him. Something had changed. He looked haggard and his face was gaunt. That's okay, Steve. Are you okay? You look ill. Steve put his hands in his head. I have been stressed. Work isn't going too well. Is it true you are seeing that man? Blessings took in a sharp intake of breath. Yes, I and Mr. Ocon are seeing each other, she said. Why not me? What does he have that I don't? Steve, I have told you I see you as a brother. Steve snarled. I sacrificed so much for you. My friendship with Cosmas. My time. I picked you up when you were at your lowest. You owe me. She backed away scared. Steve was acting crazy. I can repay every penny you spent on me and my kids, she said. His face suddenly turned ugly. You will regret this. Mark my words. He marched away, got into his red SUV, and drove off. Blessing was disconcerted. There was something different about Steve. On her way home from work, something told her she was being followed. She looked behind, and sure enough, she saw Steve's red SUV following her. She drove into a petrol station, and Steve drove past her. She called Ocon and told him what was happening. We must tell the police, he said, alarmed. Blessing shook her head. I have known him for years. He is harmless. He is just hurt that I chose to see someone else. Ocon tried to convince Blessing to go to the police, but she refused. It will blow over. Don't worry, she said. A few days later, she looked out of her apartment window and saw Steve's red car parked across the street. Her hand went to her mouth and heart hammered in her chest. She realized in shock that Steve was stalking her. Over the next month, she noticed Steve's car on her street several more times, so finally she went to the police. They weren't much help. They took a statement and said they would talk to him. One day, Steve looked up from his office desk to see Ocon. The knight in shiny armor comes to rescue his damsel, he said, a sinister smile on his face. Ocon stared at Steve. There was something unhinged about him. Why won't you leave her alone? He asked tersely. Steve leaned back and smiled. I have known her for 10 years. You are just a passing fancy. When you are gone, I will be here to pick up the pieces as always. I am here for good. Blessing and I are to be married. Steve sneered. Is that so? Has she told you why her husband left her? He said, leaning back and locking his fingers, an evil smile on his face. Did she tell you that none of her kids are for her husband? He smiled gleefully at Ocon's shocked face. It's true. They conducted 2 paternity tests, and all 3 of her kids are not for her husband. Steve got up and walked to a stunned Ocon. You don't know anything about her, he hissed. You will never marry her. Over my dead body. Ocon stared at Steve for what seemed to be an eternity, then left, the sound of Steve's sinister laughter ringing in his ears. Why didn't you tell me about the kids? Ocon asked Blessing. It was Sunday evening and they were at her house. Blessing was crying. I was going to. I didn't plan on falling in love with you. I was waiting for the right time. Ocon got up and started pacing. He didn't know what to think. All 3 aren't his? Blessing looked up sadly. I swear they are. I don't care what those test results say. You have to believe me, dear. You know me. Do I? He snapped. Blessing jerked back. The look of hurt and disappointment on Ocon's face saddened her. There's a lot to think about. I will catch up with you later. Blessing buried her head in her hands, sobbing. Ocon walked away sadly. His mind was in turmoil as he crossed the street to his car. Suddenly, he heard the sound of screeching tires. A car was racing towards him at speed. He jumped out of the way just in time, falling heavily on the hard tarmac. He looked up just in time to see the car as it turned a corner. It was a red SUV, Steve's car. Ocon did not get a wink of sleep that night. His brain was a whirlpool of activity. He cast his mind back to when Blessing had worked for him. She had never shown any signs of being a loose girl. She was a very beautiful woman, and a few guys had tried their luck, but as far as he knew, she shot them down immediately. It was hard for him to reconcile the Blessing he knew with this terrible act. Then there was Steve, a man who had clearly gone over the edge. He was worried about Blessing. Steve had tried to run him down and was stalking Blessing. He would have to do something before it went further. But then there was the elephant in the room. How could he carry on with a relationship, knowing that she had betrayed her ex-husband so badly? There was something fishy about the whole thing. He dialed Blessing's number. She seemed glad to hear from him. He told her to tell him everything that happened when she got the paternity done. Blessing explained that Cosmas had demanded a paternity test and Steve had organized everything. So you're telling me the first test was done at a hospital recommended by Steve? Ocon's eyes narrowed. What about the second test? He couldn't believe his ears. I need you to go and get a third test done. I will recommend a clinic. Ocon booked an appointment at the paternity clinic that had conducted the first test for Blessing. A smart young man attended to him. He inquired about their services, and the man explained what they had to offer. Can I speak to you in confidence? Ocon asked. The man nodded. You see, I am married, and I have a girlfriend who claims her daughter is mine. He looked around him and leaned closer to the man. To be honest, I know the child is probably mine, but I don't want to be stuck with her mother. Is it possible to, rig the test so it says the baby is not mine? The man raised an eyebrow. I see. Well, we do offer a service, but it will cost you extra. Ocon struggled to keep the surprise off his face. He could scarcely believe how matter-of-fact the man was being. How much extra? The man licked his lips nervously. He picked up the phone and made a call. You will have to speak directly to the owner, sir. A few minutes later, Ocon was talking to the owner of the test center, a smallish, thin man called Mr. Davis. I understand you have a unique problem, Mr. Davis said. Ocon nodded and explained what he wanted done. Mr. Davis leaned back and rubbed his chin. Well, we do offer this service. Every once in a while we will have a woman that wants the test to, let's say, favor her. He smiled slyly. Sometimes we get someone such as yourself, who doesn't want the responsibility of a child. He leaned forward and continued. We can help you, but it will cost you 1 million naira. Ocon's heart rate spiked. I am willing to pay, but you must assure me that the results will clearly state that I am not the father. Mr. Davis smiled. That's no problem. Ocon left the clinic and drove straight to the police station. He went to the police chief's office and presented them with a taped recording. He had been wearing a recording device while talking to Davis. The chief policeman listened to Ocon's conversation with Mr. Davis in horror. Mr. Ocon and the policeman talked long into the night. Finally, they worked out a plan. The next day, a visibly scared Mr. Davis was presented to the police chief. I am sure you have heard the taped recording of you saying you offer fake paternity tests. The chief barked. Davis bowed his head. You are in big trouble and will probably rot in prison, unless you help Mr. Ocon here with a problem. You see, your friend Dr. Steve attempted to kill him, and he is constituting a nuisance with a lady. We want you to arrange a meeting with him and wear a recording device. If you do this and successfully get evidence for us, then maybe we can be more lenient with you. The very next day, Davis arranged to see Steve at his office. Yes, why did you want to see me? Steve asked. Mr. Davis wiped the sweat from his brow nervously. He cleared his throat. I got a visitor a few days ago, he said. Remember that woman you brought here with Mr. Cosmas? Blessing? She was here? He snapped. Why? She was questioning the DNA test she did. She wants another one. Steve slammed the table with his fist. That slut. What shall we do? The same as last time. The results will show that the children are not her ex-husband's. Davis peered at Steve. There was something different about him. He seemed unhinged. Okay, we can do this, but can I just ask why you are doing all this? Steve got up and paced the room. He suddenly turned to Davis, leering. I have known Blessing since our university days. The moment I saw her, I said to myself this would be my wife. I was a lover boy back then, and all the girls used to fall for me, but not her. No matter how much I turned on the charm, the answer was always no. One day, Cosmas, my friend, asked me to introduce him to her, so I did. It never occurred to me she would like an ugly troll like Cosmas, but she, alas, her type is ugly little trolls. Davis lit a cigarette, an evil look on his face. It was painful watching them date, painful when they got married and had children. I never stopped loving her. That fool Cosmas didn't deserve her. He is a stupid village man that made her life a misery. Did you know he collected her salary, chose what she wore, forced her to be a housewife, a slave? Davis felt a shiver run down his spine. He suddenly realized that Dr. Steve was quite mad. When he came to me asking for a DNA test, I saw it as an opportunity to help Blessing. That's when I thought of you. I offered you millions to fake the test. Then they asked for another test, and I rigged that as well. I knew that Cosmas would leave her, and then I could step in. Do you know that, upon all I did, she ended up in the arms of a stupid banker? I could kill them both. I should kill them both. Davis could bear it no more. He hit the alarm button as instructed, and soon his office was flooded with burly police officers. Steve looked around him in shock. His eyes narrowed as he saw Ocon and Blessing. He turned to Davis, his face an angry mask. You bastard! You set me up! He lunged at Davis, and it took 4 policemen to restrain him. He kicked and screamed as he was bundled out of the office. The police chief addressed Ocon. Well, we have enough on tape to lock him away for a long time. He turned to Blessing, who was crying softly. I am so sorry you had to go through all that, he said sadly. We will make sure he never bothers you again. Blessing smiled weakly. Ocon drove her home, and she presented him with the test results she had taken in another clinic. Cosmas was 99.9999%, the father of her 3 boys. They both cried tears of joy. A week later, Cosmas' mouth was open in disbelief as he listened to Steve's tape confession. Afterwards, Uncle Stanley handed him the paternity results, which stated that he was the father of the boys. Cosmas sank to his knees and began sobbing. But, how was I to know Steve was such a snake? He turned to Uncle Stanley. Please, help me beg her. I miss her and my boys. I have been so miserable without them, and my business is crumbling. She was my rock. Blessing smiled. She looks more beautiful than ever. Uncle Stanley thought sadly. He had spoken to her, and there was no chance of reconciliation. In a way, he was glad. She was too good for his nephew. Blessing turned to Cosmas. I do forgive you. Your sons miss you. You can come see them whenever you wish. Cosmas was crying now. He knelt down, begging for forgiveness. I know I did a terrible thing to you, but I hope that you can find it in your heart to forgive me, and in time, maybe we can get back together. Blessing gazed at her ex-husband. She remembered his jealous rages, how she would give him her salary, how he told her what to wear. A smile played on her lips as she thought of how different Ocon was. Through adversity, she had found the love of her life. I am engaged to be married, she said. She walked out of the room to a waiting Ocon. How did it go? He asked. She smiled and kissed him. That chapter is closed. I am looking forward to a whole new life with you, my love. They walked out of Uncle Stanley's house, holding hands, looking forward to a bright new future.